Welcome, everyone. This is What Does the Torah Say About Modern Economics, a six-part series with Rabbi Jonathan Ziring. Today's class is the sixth of six sessions, so thank you for everyone who's been joining along the way. If you're joining on both Facebook Live and on Zoom, it's great to have you, and you are certainly welcome to join in the discussion. And with that, welcome Rabbi Ziring, who we have had the pleasure of learning with for
Thank
weeks.
you. So thank you to everyone for coming the last 6 weeks. To Kayla for all your help. So this is the last week. So let's give a 2-minute recap of where we are, because obviously we haven't covered all the topics that one could cover in economics. Obviously, economics covers a lot of our lives, and halacha has what to say about many aspects of it. But we've tried to focus on broader questions. The first 2 weeks we focused on Yovel, asking the question in week 1, does the Torah have a unique economic system, or can it be reduced to the other economic systems we know, be they capitalism, socialism, whatever else you want? In the second week, we continued with Yovel, and we dealt with the question of, if there is something unique that the Torah has to say about economics, can it be implemented fairly? Is it fair to implement it in a world which is not completely run under the auspices of the Torah? Or considering the impact of economics in general, does it only make sense to integrate that into a society that lives according to the Torah's principles, both theologically and its social assumptions? We examined the social element more in week 3 when we dealt with Rabbi, with the laws of interest, which, as we saw, distinguished between Jews and non-Jews on the assumption, as the Ramban would have it, that Jews have to treat each other as family, and therefore actively have to integrate non-purely economic, quote unquote, concerns into what might otherwise be considered economic. And we saw some other areas of halacha that clearly integrate non-economic factors, such as prohibitions against doing business with idolaters, because it's showing support for their religion. In week 4, we asked the question, do the Torah's laws necessarily have to apply at all times? Or is it possible that at least some laws are responsive, rather than specifically focused on pricing, where we noted that the Torah clearly says, and we'll get back to this today, that you can't overcharge or underpay, at least deceptively. But we asked the question, does that imply that the Torah believes there must be prices in all societies? And we saw a division of opinions on that, with Rabbi Weiss taking the position that there does not have to be prices, and the Torah simply says when there are prices, you have to respect them. And Zalman Nechemia Goldberg and Rav Vosner assuming that no, if the Torah regulates prices, there must be prices. And then last week, we dealt with the question of competition, where on the one hand, we saw certain reads that would suggest a certain amount of protectionism in halacha for the, let's say small businesses, for individual store owners and the like. But noted the narrowing of that in classic sources already in favor of benefiting society at large, or the consumers. But then we asked the broader question based on Rabbi Weiss again, which is, how do you deal with the fact that the cases that the Torah deals with, or that halacha deals with in terms of competition, are quite narrow, and deal with store owners who produce the same products, at basically the same prices, and the only reason there's competition is because of geographic proximity. And does that silence tell us that halacha is specifically oriented at a very narrow issue, therefore leaving large swaths of significant economic development, such as the introduction of new technologies that might disrupt the economy, and put people out of jobs, but don't directly compete? Is that something that halacha doesn't address and basically just assumes can exist? So those are the first 5 weeks in a nutshell. This week, the last thing we're going to look at is we're going to return to pricing, but from a different angle. And that is that, as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, and I'll pull up the sources now, halacha has 2 distinct laws that relate to pricing. One is the one we dealt with 2 weeks ago, which is that you can't overcharge or underpay deceptively, which, as we said, that the relevance of that law in the modern economy assumes that there are prices. But the issue we're going to see today is a little bit different, and that is the issue of price controls or price gouging, specific or price manipulation, perhaps is a better term. Namely, regardless of whether you think there is an objective price, which again we dealt with, let's say there's an average price. Are you allowed to engage in market activities within the market that are going to drive the prices, either the objective price or at least the average price or something, drive it up, right? Are you allowed to not just take advantage of whatever the price happens to be to make money, but to actually plan to create shortage, to create scarcity in order to drive prices up? Now, there are certain businesses that are basically predicated on this. So, for example, diamonds, right? Diamonds in the modern economy, they're not actually as rare as their pricing would imply, but that's because the companies that are in charge of mining diamonds and distributing diamonds set a very strict limit on how much they produce and how much they mine in a given year to create artificial scarcity, to leave the prices high. Or in the last few months, or maybe it's been more than months at this point, we're quite aware of the impact of artificially creating shortages of oil, which OPEC every so often will limit how much they produce in order to keep prices high. What does Allah have to say about things like that, right? Because there, it's not just a question of are you respecting the prices, but are you allowed to take advantage of the realities that scarcity, because of supply and demand, drives prices up? Are you allowed to take advantage of that and actually create that atmosphere? So that in halacha is called hafkaat sha'arim, price manipulation based on sha'ar, the gate, being where the market was, and therefore the price at the gate. And as we'll see, the Torah has some quite harsh things. The halacha has some harsh things to say about price manipulation, but we need to figure out what that would say in a modern economy. And we'll see that while at first glance, it seems to be quite expansive, the limitations that halacha places, that is very quickly going to be called into question. And throughout, while we'll talk about different products, I'm going to focus on two, which I think are quite interesting conceptually, because of their of just how important they are to life. One is going to be medicine. And here I really do thank Rabbi Mordechai Turchiner, who, when I was in Toronto, we co-gave series on at some point on overcharging and related issues. And he gave a shiur on the Martin Shkreli case. If you remember that from a few years ago, where Shkreli bought whatever company it was and drove the prices of, I think was it EpiPens or was it insulin, some essential, I have to look back what it was. It was one of those two, drove the prices up by like several 100% as soon as he took over the company. And also the one that I focused on at the time, which was real estate, right, was driving real estate prices up, rental and buying. Okay, so where does the idea of price controls come from in halacha? So really, it emerges from number one, as follows. In the context of the laws, more or less, of tzedakah and usury and the like, the Torah says, if your brother becomes needy and destitute and falls, and his hand falls among you, so support him. And don't take interest from him, and fear God, and your brother shall live with you. Now, this idea that your brother should live with you is taken in halachic literature to mean as Andrew tells me it was EpiPen. That was what I thought, but then I second guessed myself the incident, but it was an EpiPen. Okay, thank you. Yes. So the idea of that you have to support your brother becomes in halacha an instruction not just to give tzedakah, not just give loans, but a broader idea of supporting people financially, and therefore preventing cases in which they will not be able to be supported. And that's sort of the background to the idea of the problem of price gouging and price manipulation. For those of you who are following Yerushalmi Yomi, the news cycle began just a few weeks ago. If you're following specifically the OU and Art Scrolls cycle, then you'll be going a little slower. If you're following the classic Vilna based on the Ger Hasidim, then you'll be a little bit ahead. But either way, you will have seen the second passage here in the last few weeks. The Yerushalmi has some very harsh things to say about those who engage in price manipulation. So Amar Rabbi Alexandri, Mipnei Mait Kinu Birkat Hashanim Brachat Shi'it. Why is the 9th bracha in the Amidah the blessing that deals with sustenance, with livelihood? So the Gemara answers, Keneged Kol Hashem Shover Arazim. Because the verse in Tehillim, in Psalms, says that the sound of God breaks the cedars. Now this, if you knew the earlier part of the Gemara goes through different kolot. So this is the 9th time that the word kol comes up here. Now, why is it that God's voice shattering the cedar trees is a good symbolic link to the blessing about sustenance? So the Gemara says, Shu atid lishbor kol ba'alei sha'arim, because God is going to shatter and break market manipulators, right? So the Yerushalmi claims that, like, so definitional is reasonable pricing in the economy, and so central is it to the ability to have a livelihood and have sustenance, that instead of coming up with like a positive association with the 9th bracha, it says, no, you want to know what connects thematically to the idea of having sustenance? God coming and shattering those who manipulate prices. Right. So clearly the Yerushalmi has very negative things to say about people who basically like make life unlivable because of prices. So let's look now at the central Talmudic passage. And as we'll see, despite that maybe strong rhetoric by the Yerushalmi, this law is going to be a little bit more limited than that. Okay. So the Gemara says as follows. This is Baba Batra Tzadi Amud Bet, goes on to Tzadi Aleph Amud Aleph, that continues right in the next source. Tana Rabbana, Utsarei Perot, those who hoard produce, right? So they artificially create scarcity. Umalavei Baribit, and the people who lend money with usury. Umaktinei Eifa, and the people who make weights smaller, right? So dishonest weights. Umafkiei sharim, and price manipulators. Alehen hakatuv omer lemor matai avor achodesh vanishbira shever vashabat v'niftecha bar laktin eifa ulagdil shekel ulavet moznei mirma. So about them we say the very, very biting psukim in Amos, that Amos says these are people who present themselves as religious because they keep Shabbat, but all they can say all Shabbat is they look at their watch and they say, when is Shabbat over? I obviously can't do business on Shabbat, but I need Shabbat to be over. I need Rosh Chodesh to be over because I don't work on Rosh Chodesh. They're really, really frum, but I need Shabbat to be over so that I can steal and falsify my weights and cheat people. Like I would never do business on Shabbat. So I need Shabbat to be over so I can cheat. And about those people, God says, that God swears by the pride of Yaakov, by Jacob, I swear I will never forget what they do. So one of these horrible people, or more than one, are people who manipulate prices, either through hoarding or other ways of price manipulation. So the Gemara now clarifies, Otsrei Perot, what does it mean to hoard produce? Kigon man, who is that? Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Kigon Shabtai Otzer Perot. It's like this person, Shabtai, and he would buy and hoard large amounts of produce and then sell it later. And this was the opposite of the father of Shmuel. Avodah Shmuel, Mazman Lupeir B'Tarach Harfa, kitara charfa. He would sell produce that was in the early parts of the season when things were still cheap because there was abundance. He would sell them at the cheap price, right? He wouldn't wait till they were more expensive. He wouldn't artificially hoard. When there was a glut in the market and he had a lot, he would sell for the price. Shmuel Bray, his son, Shmuel, afla kitara charfa. But Shmuel would hold on to the produce and sell it later on where things were more expensive. Now, he wouldn't hoard per se, but he wouldn't sell during the cheaper period. And even though the Gemara seems to think that that's okay, right? He's not actually hoarding, or he's not creating scarcity. He's just choosing not to sell when things are cheap. Still, the Gemara says that's not the ideal. And Shalchu Mitam, the scholars in Israel would say, Tava da'aba midivra. The father acted better than the son. And why? My time atara de ravach, because in the end of the day, the Shmuel's father, by making things available when things were cheap, was helping people more. Shmuel wasn't hurting them per se, but it was actually actively good to sell things and let there be extra in the market, so there would be a period when people could buy at a cheap price, right? So the Gemara here, right, seems to have three levels, right? The pious thing to do is to actually sell when things are cheap at a cheap price. There's the prohibited and cursed thing to do, which is to hoard and to create artificial scarcity. And then not creating scarcity, but choosing to sell when prices are higher. That seems to be permitted, but maybe not the most pious thing to do, right? So the Talmud introduced these three levels. Amar Rav Osa Adam et Kabo Otsar. Now again, Rav, like Shmuel, permits this sort of middle level, and he says, listen, I can't artificially drive up prices. So the hoarder that we talked about before would buy up everybody, so to create scarcity and then sell at a higher price. Rav says you can't do that, but you are allowed to hold on to your own produce, right, and choose to sell it when there is less available at a higher price. Again, that's that middle level, and that is permitted. And Taninami Hachi, and similarly, we have a braita to that level. Ein otzrin peirot dvarim sheyesh ben chayi nefesh. You are not allowed to hoard fruit and things that yesh bahen chayi nefesh, that life depends on them. Kagon yenot shmanim usalatot, so oil and wine and flour, right? These were staples of life, right? Now, flour and oil we know, but wine was also a staple of life for many reasons, partially because it provided a tremendous amount of calories in storable, right? In storable form, right? Because wine could last a long time because of the fermentation; it wouldn't go bad. Possibly also, as we see later on in history, though this probably isn't as true in the early parts, it had to do with contamination of water. That's not as true in the time of Chazal, though in the medieval period, that is true that alcohol is important for liquid because it's non-contaminated. Aval tavlin, but spices are considered luxuries. So aval tavlin, kamonu pilplin, so spices, and pepper and cumin, mutar. Bamed dvarim amurim. And when do we say that there's any limits on hoarding? Bilokech menashuk. That's if you buy up the market. Aval b'machnes mishalo. But if you just hold on to your own produce and choose not to sell until the price is higher, mutar. That's permitted. Umutar l'adam letzor perot be'eretz Yisrael shalosh shanim.